Kalorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents The Politics of Mass Violence in the Middle East, Zones of Violence, by Laura Robson. Read by Lisa S. Ware. The ultimate expression of sovereignty resides, to a large degree, in the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. Achille Mbembe, Necropolitics, 2003. The practice of violence, like all action, changes the world, but the most probable change is a more violent world. Hannah Arendt, Reflections on Violence, 1969. Introduction. The Mashriq as a Zone of Violence. In 1940, Michel Aflaq, lawyer, writer, and founder of the Ba'ath Resurrection party that would dominate Syrian and Iraqi politics for much of the post-1945 era, considered the nature of violence. "When we are cruel to others," he wrote, "we know that our cruelty is meant to bring them back to their true selves, of which they are ignorant." In other words, for Aflaq, political violence had a purpose: to remake the world, to clarify the true nature of a society, to purify not just movements but individuals. Violence represented a fundamental paradox, something that could hurt and heal at the same time. Similar ideas appeared in the work of other mid-century anti-colonial thinkers, Frantz Fanon, for instance, whose passionate 1963 text, The Wretched of the Earth, depicted violence as a cathartic force, here not for the victim but for the perpetrator, who could, through the practice of violence, be freed from his inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction. Such writers, whatever we make of their advocacy, understood something centrally important about 20th century violence. It was not merely an atavistic impulse, a sign of societal breakdown, a descent into chaos, but a political decision, a deliberate strategy undertaken by identifiable actors at particular times with specific purposes. This book, then, is about the why, when, and how of the political phenomenon of mass violence in the Middle East. When did mass violence become a constitutive aspect of the political landscape of the region? Why did it take precedence over other strategies of state-building and establishing political authority, and take similar forms in different sovereign states across the region? How did governments, armies, and civilians alike come to think of mass violence as a viable and legitimate mode of claiming political space and national rights? In other words, how did mass violence come to be a primary, perhaps the primary, mode of making political claims in the 20th and 21st century Middle East? There are answers to such questions. The place of mass violence in the politics of the modern Middle East is traceable, in the first instance, to the rise of a bloody politics of territorialism derived from the late Ottoman encounter with Europe, transformed into genocidal violence by a declining empire, brutally exploited by a European colonial presence, and cemented by the externally supported promotion of ethnically and communally organized nation-states from Lebanon to Iraq to Israel. In the second half of the 20th century, both the United States and the Soviet Union accepted, normalized, and actively upheld this state of affairs, making use of local communal politics to promote their respective national interests and maintain access to Middle Eastern resources, particularly, but not exclusively, oil. In fact, the Middle East's emergence as a zone of violence, characterized by a viciously dystopian politics of identity, has relatively shallow historical roots, developing only over the past century or so. A historical correction that, of course, does little to lessen the intractability of the problems of mass violence and dispossession that now seem to characterize the region so completely. The region with which this book is primarily engaged is known in Middle East studies as the Mashriq. That is, the Arab-speaking lands east of Egypt and north of the Arabian Peninsula, centering around Balad al-Sham, Greater Syria. The word Mashriq is a cognate of the better-known term Maghrib, one describing the eastern territories of the eastern Mediterranean and its hinterlands, the other the western lands of North Africa. Scholars understand the Mashriq as a large and diverse part of the Arab world that nevertheless occupied an identifiable and distinct political space within the Ottoman sphere before the 20th century, and remained deeply intertwined with Turkey and the Caucasus after the empire's dissolution. This space is usually understood to include neither the Arabian Peninsula nor Iran, though both of those have remained political, economic, and cultural interlocutors throughout the modern era. Egypt, though it is sometimes included in definitions of the Mashriq, historically constituted a rather separate space. Few Egyptians, even elites with strong intellectual connections in the Levant, thought of themselves as Arabs until the mid-1930s, and Egyptian identification with Arabism did not really gather support among non-elites until the 1950s. Further, Egypt's 19th century history of distance and removal from the Ottoman state and its colonial occupation by the British from 1882 onwards separated it quite dramatically from the political trajectory of the other Ottoman Arab provinces, and lent its later nationalism and its post-colonial history a specifically Egyptian cast. All reasons for regarding its history as distinct. As I am using the term here, then, the Mashriq includes the modern nation-states of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories, Jordan, and Iraq. Together they constitute a kind of central piece of the modern Middle East, including most of its major urban centers, embodying its connections to Europe via a shared Mediterranean, and, important for our purposes, enclosing its most central 20th century source of conflict, the contested territory of Palestine. This book examines the history of the modern Mashriq through the lens of mass bloodshed, tracing episodes of large-scale violence against civilians, usually defined ethnically, communally, or politically, through the long 20th century. This is an unusual approach for a number of reasons. First, the study of mass violence as such has so far been largely confined to the relatively new field of genocide studies, which focuses almost obsessively on questions of definition. For genocide studies scholars, the question of which instances of mass violence count as genocide, reckoned either under the legal definitions of the UN Convention on Genocide or with reference to the writings of Raphael Lemkin, the coiner of the term, has become the central issue of the field. Analysis of genocidal violence thus very often attempts first to tease out which events might constitute genocide under current legal definitions, and then seeks to offer typologies or categories of such genocidal violence, often without much regard to local circumstances or much reference to the relevant area studies literature. The exception to this is the extensive writing on the Holocaust, which is almost alone in genocide studies and coming from scholars trained to do empirical work in Central and Eastern Europe, though work on the Armenian genocide has been catching up in recent years. The consequence is a field that, in the words of the editors of this series, manages to be simultaneously too generalistic or schematic in its comparative approach and too exclusive in its frames of reference. Few of the many bloodbaths that occurred in the 20th century Middle East would qualify as genocides under the UN's legal definition, though, as we will discuss, there are exceptions. Nevertheless, there is real value in thinking about the mass violence that has unfolded there as a collective phenomenon, one that crosses national borders and has come to characterize the political landscape of the region as a whole. And here we run into another difficulty, this time from the perspective of area studies and modern Middle Eastern history. Although there is a large scholarly literature on the 20th century Middle East, and especially on Israel/Palestine, there are strikingly few works that seek to understand the region, including Israel, as a whole entity, and to identify unifying themes of its modern historical trajectory. Indeed, the literature on the 20th century Middle East has tended rigorously to separate Israel/Palestine from the rest of the region to the extent that it exists as something of a distinct subfield, one which, it need hardly be said, has an unusually presentist bent and remains quite methodologically conservative. Even more antithetical to integrationist historical analysis has been the attempt to separate out Palestine and Israel studies, an approach, enjoying considerable prominence at the moment, that makes impossible any real assessment of their inextricably intertwined modern histories. Furthermore, histories of the Arab world, following on a tendency of post-colonial historiography globally, have bent toward national atomization, treating Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and in some cases even Lebanon and Jordan as basically separate histories even while recognizing their recent genesis as nation-states. Perhaps it is fair to say that the entirely understandable urge to defend national visions of post-colonial viability, especially for Palestine, which of course has yet to achieve that status politically, has to some extent prevented scholars from recognizing and exploring transnational and transregional themes in the Middle East's modern history. This book, then, uses a framework of mass violence, encompassing the concepts of genocide, ethnic cleansing, forced migration, appropriation of resources, mass imprisonment, and forcible denationalization, to explain the emergence of a dystopian politics of identity across the Eastern Mediterranean in the modern era, and illuminate the contemporary breakdown of the state from Syria to Iraq to Israel. It tracks instances of brutality against civilians from the late 19th century to the beginning of the 21st, as successive episodes in an unfolding, longer and broader history of inscribing violence at the heart of state power across the modern Mashriq. Such an approach suggests that mass violence in the modern Middle East represents the opposite of atavistic communal impulses. It is, in fact, almost wholly wrapped up with structures of modernity, and particularly with two characteristically 20th century phenomena: state centralization and the concomitant territorialization of national, ethnic, and religious identities, both inherently violent processes that became all the more brutal for unfolding in a context of constant incursions from outside powers. The historian Charles Ware has argued powerfully that the most fundamental marker of the 20th century was not industrialization or nationalism, or the confrontation between authoritarianism and democracy, or even some ambiguous understanding of modernity, but rather territoriality, an enhanced concept of territory, not just as an acquisition or as a security buffer, but as a decisive means of power and rule. The saturation of territory with the mechanics of power, rail lines, telegraph networks, deployed soldiers, and the physical infrastructure of occupation characterized late empire across the globe, and nowhere more than in the Middle East. The late Ottoman state main goal, in the face of European military and political challenges continually chipping land away at the edges of the empire, was to take fuller control over its territory and make greater use of all the resources, including people, within the bounds of the state. In the course of this attempt at territorialization and centralization, it began to regard resistant populations, sometimes but not always defined ethnically or communally, as territorial challenges to the state, a first step toward the zero-sum game that eventually led to its genocide of the Armenians. Later, as the Mashriq fell under European colonial rule in the aftermath of the First World War, the very lateness of the imperial project meant the deployment of specifically 20th century modes of establishing territoriality. Modern colonial bureaucracies and militaries with the capacity to categorize, rank, and physically distribute their subjects in ways that made imperial power over specific territories and resources visible to all. It is no accident that some of the best-known images of European colonialism in the Middle East are of maps. The Sykes-Picot Agreement that distributed the region's territory among the European imperial powers in 1916. The delineation of the oil-rich Mosul province as part of Iraq in 1925. The Peel Commission's proposed division of Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish territories in 1937. In all these cases, late Ottoman, British, and French alike, these claims to new forms and shapes of territorial control were to be accomplished via force. The imperial states in the Mashriq owed their shape, literally, to the exercise of mass violence against civilians. And in the process, they often territorialized their subjects internally as well, forcibly removing and resettling populations and communities whose social identities, religious, linguistic, ethnic, thereby became attached to particular geographical spaces. As a consequence, by the time the British and the French were finally forced out of Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, violence was already a constitutive part of statehood across the region, not only in terms of borders, but in terms of practices of governance over the Mashriq's pluralistic populations. The process of decolonization, that is, the utter refusal of the British and French to give up their claims over Middle Eastern territory and resources until they were confronted with force, further cemented the centrality of violence for post-colonial state-making. In Syria and Lebanon, the French were removed, somewhat ironically, by British soldiers and their Free French collaborators. In Palestine, the British were driven out not just by Arab resistance, but also by militant Zionist settlers whose Jewish proto-state they had themselves fostered. In Iraq, only a military coup finally ended British claims over strategic territory and oil resources. For weak, uncertain, and nervous post-colonial regimes, violence, expressed both externally and internally, now became a primary mode of claiming not just authority, but legitimacy and permanence. Despite their mutual antagonism and their very different, indeed actively oppositional, paths to nation-statehood, Israel and its Arab neighbors in many ways followed similar trajectories during the immediate post-colonial years, becoming ethnically and communally defined nations in which post-colonial administrations enforced boundaries of political belonging through the deliberate deployment of state violence against communities within their borders. Such violence was designed above all to enforce territoriality, to delineate the borders of sovereignty as fundamentally unchallengeable, and to ensure deep control over these new regimes' land, resources, and people. There was an important material element to this state-level enforcement of post-colonial territoriality as well. All of the states that emerged in the Mashriq after 1948, including Israel, were hobbled by some degree by decades of ruthlessly exploitative colonial rule, the large populations of migrants and refugees within their borders, and, in some cases, the ongoing ownership of physical and territorial resources, particularly those related to oil, by foreign corporations backed by powerful international interests. Consequently, though different types of post-colonial governments emerged across the region, from revolutionary regimes in Iraq and Syria, to conservative monarchy in Jordan, to communally delimited semi-democracies in Israel and Lebanon, they all found themselves looking to external sources for money and arms, not so much to resist external incursions as to maintain themselves domestically. It was a development the Cold War-era superpowers were happy to support, and over the subsequent 2 decades their interventions produced a region of theoretically sovereign states, whose resources, markets, and territories could often be turned to the interests of the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France without the political complications and substantial expense of actual imperial rule. In practical terms, this meant legitimizing and supporting regimes that articulated government control through violence directed at potentially threatening sectors of their own populations. Communities that, on the colonial model, were often understood communally. Following the 1967 war, the oil-consuming powers doubled down on a policy of active encouragement of sectarian violence and authoritarian oppression, not only via words of support and reassurance, and turning a blind eye at crucial moments, but through the generous and ongoing provision of tanks, missiles, guns, poison gas, helicopters, airplanes, and bombs, to a set of ethno-nationally defined, and often increasingly authoritarian, governments attempting to establish their political legitimacy. The weapons that proliferated in every state of the Mashriq during these decades did make appearances in interstate warfare, but just as frequently they were used against elements of states' own populations to consolidate and establish territoriality, thus inscribing force over and over again as the only viable, legitimate, and permanent mode of political authority and territorial control. This external provision of weapons, and the political space to use them, produced some of the most shocking spectacles of late 20th century mass violence anywhere, from the Lebanese Civil War to the massacres of Palestinian refugees at Sabra and Shatila, to the Iraqi campaign against the Kurds that became known as the Anfal. Every one of these bloody episodes would be explained away by the superpowers who had acted as collaborators and enablers, as manifestations of a kind of atavistic sectarianism that had haunted the Middle East for decades if not centuries, and about which little or nothing could be done. There is a final point to make here. Throughout the 20th century, external powers repeatedly and consistently made use of the Middle East as a venue for declaring their participation in discursively liberal political formulations whose practice on the ground emerged as illiberal, anti-democratic, and focused on the extraction and exploitation of material resources. In the decades before the First World War, this took the form of treaty arrangements, defending the rights of minorities, and supporting irredentist national movements in the Balkans with the goal of maintaining European commercial endeavors and military access to Ottoman space. In the interwar period, it meant constant reference to principles of representative government while enforcing military rule and settler colonialism in the Mandate states. In the post-World War II period, it meant the use of both communist and anti-communist rhetoric to shroud various forms of military intervention, support for authoritarian regimes, and massive arms sales, all modes of maximizing European and American access to oil. National movements and governments often reproduced this disconnect, as authoritarian regimes from the Committee of Union and Progress to Saddam Hussein made use of discourses of representation, constitutionalism, and law to advance fundamentally exploitative and extractive, and often actively sectarian, political practices. Along with the violent production of territoriality, this long history of simultaneous appropriation of and brutal opposition to liberalizing political agendas, from both within and without, serves as crucial context for contemporary developments. It helps to illuminate, for instance, the slide from broadly based pro-democracy demonstrations to the violent reassertion of authoritarianism in the recent Arab Spring. And it is this particular modern history, not some kind of long-standing religious fragmentation, that explains the Mashriq's emergence over the past 150 years as an apparently intractable zone of violence. 1. The late Ottoman practice of violence, 1878 to 1914. The Ottoman state that held sway across much of the Arab world had long represented one of the world's most extensive and powerful empires. But by the middle of the 19th century, it found itself increasingly beleaguered. The empire had been shrinking, albeit slowly and intermittently, for 2 centuries. Now, the Ottoman government faced a sudden and dramatic loss of land to irredentist nationalist movements in the Balkans, as well as major Western European economic encroachment across the eastern Arab provinces, and ongoing territorial challenges from its old imperial rival, Russia. Discussions about the partitioning of the Ottoman state were beginning to proliferate in the diplomatic circles of Western Europe. The imperial debt was growing. Egypt had been lost. Something had to be done. For many Ottoman strategists intent on saving the empire, the answer lay in major political reforms that would bestow the imperial government with strong centralized control over not just its metropole, but also its provinces. An empire-wide shift was soon underway, one that would reimagine Ottoman subjects as national citizens, require new expressions of loyalty to the state, and modernize and strengthen the military, all in the service of endowing the Ottoman state with a greater capacity to face its European challengers and take firmer control of the resources, lands, and peoples within its borders. In the late 19th century, such reforms remade the Ottoman Arab provinces, encompassing more or less the entirety of the Mashriq, as a much more central piece of the Ottoman imperial state, with an emerging multi-confessional urban elite enjoying its newly acquired political influence and economic opportunity. They also contributed substantially to new kinds of resentment, conflict, and communal violence, particularly among less privileged rural populations who experienced this imperial consolidation mainly as a loss of political and economic autonomy. Further west, European encroachment proved rather deadlier. In 1878, the Treaty of Berlin forever changed the nature of ethnic and communal relations in the Ottoman sphere by committing the European powers to the military enforcement of territorially bounded ethnic identities in the Balkans and beyond. The subsequent Balkan Wars, in which European imperial intervention, sometimes inadvertently, helped remake local grievances into proto-nationalist separatist movements, gradually served to create new ethnic nationalisms on the ground, often violently. It was in this context of Balkan struggle that a new Ottoman regime rose to power, the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP. A movement deriving initially from demands for constitutional reform, but whose priorities, as it gradually assumed power, proved to lie above all with the territorial consolidation of the besieged imperial state by any means necessary. All these developments, the European ethnicization of imperial intervention, the takeover of the Ottoman state by a group of military politicians from Salonika, and their forcible territorialization of the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?